Grandpa's Rail Tales by E.C. Hill. Illustrated by Robert Bender. Page 3. It was a February evening many years ago, and it was snowing softly. I was just 7 years old then. My father led me by the hand as we walked toward the tiny railroad station in our village. We could hear cheerful voices from the station before we got close enough to peek through the window. Around a table, in the middle of the room, a crowd of people had gathered. It was Grandpa's retirement party, and as usual, he was the center of attention. Page 4. Grandpa was old, but he was the life of the party. I've never known anyone who could spin a tale like that man. He had worked as an engineer on the railroads, running trains all over the country. He loved his work. Next to Grandma and my father and his grandkids, I'm sure he loved that job more than anything in the world. "Well, look who's here," he called out when he saw Dad and me at the door. "Come on in, before you catch cold." I ran over to him, and the next thing I knew, he was swinging me up into his lap and giving me a hug. My father brought me some juice, as I listened to all the laughing and talking around the table. I had almost no idea what a retirement party was, but I did know that Grandpa had been working for a long time, and from now on, he wouldn't be. I wondered about that. In the midst of all the chatter, I whispered a question to him. "Grandpa," I said, "you're not going back to work on the train anymore." "No, sweetheart. That's what retirement means. I'm stepping down and letting the young ones get a chance to run the train." "You were doing it a long time, weren't you, Grandpa?" I asked. 56 years, sweet pea. 56 wonderful years," he answered. Page 5. Everyone was still talking and laughing, but one friend heard Grandpa say that. He then leaned over and congratulated my grandfather. 56 years? What a record, he said. Then another friend chimed in. Those were the best 56 years the railroad company ever got from an engineer. In all the talking, I started doing a little math. We had celebrated Grandpa's 65th birthday just a few months before. Something seemed a little fishy. "Grandpa, did you really become an engineer when you were only 9? Suddenly, everyone hushed up. "My goodness," Grandpa said, "aren't you quick with the arithmetic?" He didn't bat an eye, but went on cheerfully. "Yes, I did start engineering when I was 9. Page 6. 9 years old? His sister asked in a teasing voice. "Oh, come on now. Old grandfather time. You did no such thing." Grandpa's sister was almost as old as he was and teased him more than anyone else could. Then she said to me, "Darlene, he's just telling his stories. You've got to be careful when that man spins a tale." "Now I'm just as honest can be," Grandpa protested, as he held up his hand to quiet his sister. "It's just that we grew up quickly in those days." "Wasn't it hard to be an engineer when you were that little, Grandpa?" I asked. "Not at all. It was easy as pie. I had been an assistant engineer for 6 years by then, so I knew all about it. In fact, I thought it was high time for a promotion." Everyone burst out laughing, but it took me a moment to get his joke. That meant he had started working on the train when he was 3. Just imagining a 3-year-old working on a train made me laugh too. After the laughter died away, there was more conversation. Finally, it was time to cut the cake. "Are you ready for cake, Darlene?" Grandma asked me, as she set a beautiful cake in the center of the table. I looked at the design on the frosting. Grandma had used colored icing to draw a little picture. It showed a locomotive that seemed to float in the sky on a puffy cloud. Page 7. That's funny, I said. This train looks like it's flying. It's almost like a plane. Grandpa broke into a mischievous smile. That's right, just like a plane, he exclaimed. That was the scariest train ride I ever took. In all my years, I don't remember anything to beat that. Grandma must have seen my eyes grow wide in amazement. Grandma winked at me and then cocked an eye at Grandpa. The scariest ride you ever took? Do tell, Grandfather, she said. Do tell. Page 9. I suppose I will. I remember it like it was yesterday, even if it was 40 years ago. In fact, it was New Year's Eve, 1900. What happened, Grandpa? I asked. Well, we were over in Illinois, not far from the big river. That's what we called the Mississippi River in those days. The night was cold and damp, and foggier than I'd ever seen before. The fog was so thick in places, you couldn't see the light shining out in front of the train. It was so thick, you could almost take it in your hands like snow and pat it into fog ball. We were going quick, over those little hills in that country. Each time we dipped down between the hills, we went into a fog bank. That fog was getting worse and worse all night. Finally, we climbed one little hill and broke out into the most beautiful moonlit night you've ever seen. But this time, when we started down the far side of the hill, we didn't sink into the fog. It was too thick. We just rode out on the top of it. I gaped at Grandma. She just smiled and rolled her eyes. Page 10. It was like riding on a sea of pearls. It was so pretty up there, he went on. Every now and then, I could see the tops of telegraph poles sticking up through all that fog. All I had to do was follow them along until I could see the lights of East Street, East St. Louis, about a mile away. I brought that train into the station just as easy as could be. Oh, you didn't, someone joshed. Indeed, I did. We were right on time, too. Everyone laughed when they heard that. Grandpa just sat back and smiled. Are you sure that's the way it happened? Grandma teased. Sure, I'm sure, came the retort. I've noticed that sometimes you doubt my word. I've never doubted you, said Grandma, but sometimes I do wonder, like that dog story you sometimes tell. That one sounded mighty unlikely to me. Unlikely, Grandpa huffed. Well then, I just won't ever tell it again. Tell it, everyone demanded. They knew he couldn't resist a good story. What kind of dog was it, Grandpa? I asked. A smart one, sugar, that's what kind. It was probably the smartest dog that ever lived. It was surely the smartest dog I ever saw. The smartest dog that ever lived? My dad asked. Do tell, Papa, do tell, he said through a grin. Page 12. Well, if you insist, I suppose I will. Grandpa took a sip of soda, then began. I recollect it was 1907 when my partner, old Pete, first brought that dog on board. It was a pretty yellow dog, and she loved to sit up in the cab with us. She jumped right in like she was born to ride the rails, and she always kept her eye on old Pete and me. She watched like she knew what we were doing. Page 13. Well, one very hot day in August of that year, we were coming in toward Memphis. It was so hot in the cab, even the thermometer started sweating. We could barely stand it. In fact, old Pete couldn't stand it. One minute he was preparing his signals, the next minute he was lying flat on the floor. He had fainted from all that heat, just as we were coming into town. Grandpa sighed and shook his head. Now this would have been bad at any time, since Pete was a good man. But it was a terrible time for him to faint like that. He was supposed to blow the whistle and let everyone know we were coming into town, so they could clear the track. Page 14. There wasn't a moment to spare, and I couldn't do his job and mine at the same time. Just then, up jumps the dog. She stands up on her hind legs and catches the whistle chain in her paw. Then she piped out a signal loud and clear. In fact, she gave a series of 3 little toots with a long wail at the end, just like old Pete always did. Indeed, old Pete couldn't have done it better. I couldn't help laughing when I heard that. "Come on, Grandpa. No dog is that smart," I said. "This one was," Grandpa insisted. "In fact, she was smarter than I've let on. After she sent the signal, she turned to help old Pete. She picked up her water dish, walked over to Pete, and poured the water all over his face. Then she sat up on his chest and gently slapped his cheeks with her paws to wake him up. Brought him right around, too. Old Pete was mighty grateful. That tale tickled my dad especially. He laughed and laughed until he was all laughed out. Finally, he said, "Papa, I'd love to hear you talk that, but I've got to take your granddaughter home. It's almost her bedtime." Page 16. I knew I couldn't argue, so I turned and kissed Grandpa goodnight, then slid off his lap. I hugged his sister and my grandma. Then my dad and I said our other goodbyes and went out into the cold night. Our footsteps were quiet in the soft snow as we walked home. As we walked, we could still hear pearls of laughter ring out from the station house. My father seemed awfully quiet as he walked, but not at all sad. I knew he had enjoyed the party. "Dad, Grandpa tells some pretty funny stories. I think he is just about the best storyteller I've ever heard." He smiled proudly and said, "Do tell, sweetheart, do tell." The end.